She vanished from a sleepover on a warm suburban night, leaving behind her shoes, her diary, and a family that never stopped setting an extra place at the table. 22 years later, a forgotten basement door groaned open, and what waited in the dark finally whispered where Melissa had gone. It was a gray morning in the spring of 2009 when a team of contractors arrived at a forgotten house on the edge of town. The property had been empty for years, its windows boarded, its garden grown wild with weeds that reached waist-high. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew, the kind of scent that clings to abandoned places where no one has lived or laughed for a long time. The workers had been hired to gut the house and prepare it for demolition. To them, it was just another job, another shell of a home that would soon give way to something modern and clean. None of them imagined that what lay hidden inside the walls would reopen a mystery more than 2 decades old. The men began by clearing out broken furniture and loose plaster. They moved through the rooms with little care, their boots crunching over shattered glass and crumbling tile. In the basement, they expected the same mess they had found above, but what they discovered was stranger. Against one wall stood a set of shelves, tall and uneven, stacked with rusted paint cans and tools coated in thick dust. When one of the workers tried to move the shelves aside, he noticed something odd. The wood did not sit flush against the wall. Behind the shelves there was a faint outline, like the shape of a door sealed shut long ago. At first they thought it was nothing more than poor construction. Yet curiosity took over. They pulled the shelves away and revealed a heavy iron door set deep into the concrete. The door had no handle, only a lock that had corroded into a lump of metal. One of the men whistled, remarking that he had never seen anything like it in a family basement. The room grew still as they looked at each other, the noise of their work fading as the weight of the discovery settled in. They called their supervisor, who arrived within the hour, and told them to cut the lock. The grinding of the saw filled the basement, sparks flying as metal gave way. When the lock finally snapped, a sharp smell drifted out from the cracks, stale air trapped for years. The men hesitated, but the supervisor insisted. Together they pulled the iron door open, its hinges groaning as if they resented being disturbed. What lay beyond was a narrow set of stairs descending into darkness. The workers shined their flashlights down and saw the outline of a small hidden chamber, untouched by daylight since the door was sealed. Inside the chamber, the air was thick and sour. The concrete walls were stained with water damage, the floor littered with scraps of fabric and old newspapers. Against one wall sat a narrow cot, its mattress brittle with age. Nearby lay a small table, and on it a bracelet dulled by dust but still intact. The bracelet bore initials carefully engraved, M.H. None of the men knew the meaning, but one of them whispered that he remembered hearing those letters before in news reports from years ago. By evening, the police had arrived, and the property was sealed off. Within days, investigators confirmed what the bracelet suggested. The hidden basement was tied to the case of a girl who had vanished from a sleepover in 1987, ATM, a mystery that had haunted families and detectives for more than 20 years. The house, long forgotten and left to rot, had been keeping its secret all along. The summer of 1987 was hot and restless, the kind of season when children stayed outside until the streetlights buzzed on and parents called them back inside. In a quiet suburb lined with maples and trimmed lawns, 14-year-old Melissa Hartley was preparing for what seemed like an ordinary night. She had been invited to a sleepover just a few houses down, the sort of gathering she had been to many times before. She packed a small overnight bag with her pajamas, a toothbrush, and her favorite book, then tucked her diary beneath the clothes at the last minute. It was never far from her, filled with neat handwriting and careful notes about her days, her worries, and her dreams. Her mother reminded her not to stay up too late. Her father kissed her on the head, and Melissa set off down the sidewalk, her sneakers slapping lightly against the pavement. The house where the sleepover was held belonged to the Parkers, a family well known in the neighborhood. Their daughter, Julie, was one of Melissa's closest friends. The plan was simple, just a night of movies, snacks, and whispered conversations that would stretch into the early hours. The girls spread sleeping bags across the living room floor, the hum of a fan cutting through the sticky air. They passed around bowls of popcorn, drank soda straight from the can, and laughed until their stomachs hurt. At some point, someone suggested telling ghost stories, and Melissa, always the careful listener, leaned in close with wide eyes, her diary resting beside her bag in the corner. The night wore on, and though the mood was playful, neighbors later recalled strange details. A dog barked for nearly an hour, its owner saying later that it had never acted like that before. A car rolled slowly down the street without headlights, pausing near the Parker driveway before moving on. None of the girls noticed at the time. To them, The world outside the living room hardly existed. Around 2 in the morning, Melissa rose quietly, saying she was heading to the kitchen for a drink of water. She padded down the hallway, her silhouette briefly lit by the glow of the television, and disappeared from sight. No one thought much of it at first. A few minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Julie went to look for her, calling her name softly so as not to wake her parents, but the kitchen was empty. The back door stood unlocked, a curtain shifting faintly with the breeze. Melissa's bag remained by the couch, her diary still tucked inside, her shoes still by the door. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and never returned. By dawn, the Parkers were calling the Hartleys. At first, everyone assumed Melissa had walked home without saying anything, but her bed was untouched and her parents had not seen her since she left. Police were called, neighbors gathered, and by mid-morning the quiet street buzzed with the sound of worried voices. Officers searched yards, checked alleys, and drove through nearby roads, but no sign of the girl was found. Some whispered that she had run away, but those who knew her best shook their heads. Melissa had left behind everything, even the diary she guarded so closely. It was not the act of a girl running away, it was the act of someone who had vanished. The memory of that night stayed with the girls who were there, replaying again and again like a tape they could not stop. They were only 14, still young enough to feel safe under the roof of a familiar home, yet old enough to sense the thrill of staying up past midnight. The Parker living room was crowded with blankets and pillows, the air filled with the smell of microwave popcorn and melted chocolate from candy bars left too close to the lamp. A small television flickered in the corner, playing the kind of movies parents said were too scary but teenagers loved anyway. Melissa sat between Julie and another friend, her laughter soft but easy, her eyes bright even as the night grew long. They played silly games, passing a flashlight between them when the movie became too tense, daring each other to go to the kitchen alone, daring each other to whisper secrets into the dark. Someone had smuggled in soda and chips, and the sound of cans cracking open seemed louder than anything else in the room. They whispered about boys, about teachers they disliked, about summer plans. Melissa had a quiet way of listening, but every so often she would break into laughter, her diary always close by, her thoughts sometimes scribbled down in quick notes when the others were too distracted to notice. Around midnight the mood began to settle. One girl fell asleep, curled up in her sleeping bag. Another drifted off not long after. But Melissa, Julie, and 2 others stayed awake, voices hushed as if they did not want the night to end. The fan rattled in the window, the only steady sound in the background. At one point, Melissa got up to stretch, walking toward the hall with bare feet that made no noise on the carpet. She returned a few minutes later with a glass of water, the condensation dripping down the sides. No one thought much of it. By 2 in the morning the girls were yawning but still awake, stubbornly holding on to the magic of the sleepover. Melissa rose again, this time with the same easy smile, saying she was thirsty. She disappeared into the hallway, her shadow stretching across the living room as the light of the television flickered. The kitchen was just steps away, and no one worried. They expected her back in a moment. Minutes ticked by. The movie rolled on, the credits eventually filling the screen. Julie finally noticed the glass Melissa had left behind, still half full on the table. She got up, walked down the hall, and called her friend's name. The kitchen light was off, the sink empty. The back door was unlocked, the curtain at the window shifting gently as if someone had moved it. Melissa's shoes were still by the front door, her bag still on the floor near the couch. Nothing was missing except her. Julie returned to the living room, uneasy, her voice trembling when she told the others. They thought Melissa was playing a trick, maybe hiding in a closet, or crouching behind a chair. They searched the house quietly, not wanting to wake the parents, but every room was empty. When the sun rose, Melissa's place on the floor was still vacant, her blanket untouched, her diary left behind. She had stepped into the hallway and vanished, leaving behind only questions that would haunt everyone who had been there that night. The morning after Melissa vanished began with confusion that quickly turned into fear. At first, the Parker parents thought she had slipped home in the night without waking anyone. But when the Hartleys answered the phone, their voices cracked with worry. Melissa had not returned. Her bed was untouched, her shoes still waiting by the door. By mid-morning, police cars rolled into the quiet street, their flashing lights cutting across the calm of a summer Saturday. Neighbors came outside in robes and slippers, clutching coffee cups, whispering to one another, as uniformed officers stepped out and began asking questions. The first search was simple, a sweep of the Parker house from top to bottom. Officers checked closets, the attic, and the basement, calling her name in firm voices, but the only sounds that answered were the creaks of the old wood. They walked through the backyard, checked the gate, and moved on to the street. A canine unit arrived, the dogs restless, their handlers snapping leashes into place. Melissa's parents provided a sweater from her room, the fabric still carrying her scent. The dogs sniffed eagerly and set off, noses low to the ground, pulling hard as they tracked her trail. The neighborhood watched in silence as the dogs moved down the block. The handlers called out directions, guiding them toward the end of the street. Melissa's scent was clear, steady, until it reached the corner where the pavement met a wide road lined with parked cars. There the dogs circled, whined, and scratched at the ground, confused. After a few minutes they sat back on their haunches, unable to find the trail again. It was as if Melissa had walked to that corner and then simply vanished. The handlers exchanged uneasy glances. Meanwhile, Melissa's parents knocked on every door. Some neighbors opened immediately, their faces pale as they swore they had not seen anything unusual. Others hesitated, peering through curtains before finally unlocking their doors. The Hartleys pleaded for information, showing a photo of their daughter, smiling shyly in her school picture. A few people remembered hearing dogs barking the night before. One woman mentioned a car driving without headlights, but no one could say for certain what they had seen. The police extended the search radius, moving through backyards, alleys, and small wooded lots. Officers used long sticks to push aside tall grass, looking for any trace of the girl. Helicopters circled above, their blades thumping in the hot air. Volunteers gathered at the local church, ready to join the search parties. By afternoon, dozens of people combed through fields and ditches, their voices echoing as they called Melissa's name. Each hour that passed deepened the dread, because nothing was found. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue that could explain what had happened. That night, the neighborhood felt different. Porch lights stayed on, curtains remained open, and parents kept their children close. Police cars lingered on the street, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. Melissa's absence was heavy, pressing down on every home. The first search had ended, but the mystery had only begun, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. In the days after Melissa's disappearance, the town shifted from shock to restless speculation. At first, everyone spoke in whispers, as if lowering their voices would somehow soften the truth. But soon, the whispers became louder, spilling across front porches, grocery store aisles, and school hallways. People needed answers, and when none came from the police, they began to make their own. Some insisted Melissa had run away. They said 14 was an age of rebellion, that maybe she had wanted freedom from rules and curfews. A few claimed they had seen her looking distracted in the weeks before, walking with her head down, carrying that ever-present diary. They imagined she had packed a secret bag and slipped into the night chasing some adventure, but her parents shook their heads at this idea. Melissa had left her belongings behind, her favorite clothes, her Walkman, even the diary that she never let out of her sight. To them it was proof she had not chosen to go. Others whispered about a stranger. They remembered the car that rolled down the street without headlights, the one that paused near the Parker driveway. Some swore they had never seen that vehicle before. A dark sedan with tinted windows. Maybe someone had been watching, waiting for the moment when a young girl was alone. The thought unsettled everyone, because it meant the danger might still be out there, circling their quiet streets. Parents began locking doors earlier in the evening. Children were no longer allowed to ride bikes until dusk, and sleepovers were quietly canceled. Then came the darker theory, the one that spread like smoke, though no one wanted to speak it aloud. What if the answer was not outside the house, but inside it? What if someone at the sleepover knew more than they were saying? People questioned the Parker family in hushed tones. They asked why Melissa had gone to the kitchen alone, why no one heard a door open, why her absence was not noticed until morning. The Parkers defended themselves with trembling voices, insisting they had been asleep, that they had woken to chaos like everyone else. Still, doubt clung to them. In small towns, suspicion does not fade easily. The police tried to calm the noise. They told reporters there was no evidence of a runaway, no proof of an abduction, no reason to believe the hosts had done anything wrong. But with no answers, their words carried little weight. Each day the case grew colder, and each day the rumors grew hotter. The Hartleys walked through town with hollow eyes, forced to overhear the theories about their daughter. Sometimes sympathy came in the form of a hand on the shoulder, other times in the form of cruel questions that tore at them like fresh wounds. Summer dragged on under the weight of speculation. The heat pressed heavy, the nights were restless, and Melissa's absence became the center of every conversation. The truth was still out there, buried beneath layers of rumor and doubt, but no one could find it. The Hartleys refused to let Melissa's name fade into silence. From the first week after she vanished, they filled the town with her face, printing stacks of flyers at the local copy shop until the machine overheated. Her school photo, with her shy smile and straight brown hair, looked back from telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards, and the windows of every small business that agreed to help. The words "missing" in bold black letters hung over her picture like a wound the town could not look away from. Each night her parents drove through neighboring towns, tacking flyers to community boards, slipping them under doors, handing them out at gas stations. Strangers who stopped for fuel or food would leave with Melissa's face folded in their pockets. The family begged television stations for coverage, calling every newsroom within driving distance. Some reporters came, setting up cameras in front of the Hartley home, asking questions while neighbors peered from behind curtains. Melissa's mother spoke through tears, describing her daughter's laugh, her love of books, her habit of writing everything down. Her father stood beside her, jaw clenched, voice breaking as he promised not to stop until they found answers. For a brief moment, the story made evening news, the image of a vanished girl flashing across living rooms far beyond their small town. But as weeks turned into months and new tragedies filled the headlines, the cameras drifted away. Left behind, the Hartleys turned to their own search. They walked wooded trails with flashlights, calling Melissa's name until their voices cracked. They combed through fields and shallow creeks, convinced they might stumble on some clue the police had missed. Volunteers joined at first, dozens of townsfolk moving in lines, scanning every ditch and abandoned lot. Over time, the numbers thinned until only the family remained, clinging to hope like a lifeline. They carried sandwiches and water bottles, spending entire weekends wandering places no one else dared to go, returning home empty-handed yet unwilling to stop. Melissa's younger brother, Daniel, was only 8 when she disappeared. He watched the flyers go up, watched his parents turn their grief into relentless action. His childhood was shaped by absence, by the shadow of the sister whose room was left untouched, her posters still taped to the walls, her diary locked away in a drawer no one dared open. Friends at school whispered about Melissa, some cruelly suggesting she had run away, others offering pity that felt heavier than silence. Daniel grew quiet, careful, carrying the weight of her memory even as he tried to grow into his own life. Every milestone, every birthday, was marked by the missing chair at the table. Years passed, yet the Hartleys never stopped. They joined support groups for families of the missing, traveled to rallies, spoke at schools about safety. Their desperation became a rhythm, a way of surviving. Melissa was gone, but they refused to let the world forget her. For them, the search was the only way to keep her close. From the very beginning, mistakes were made, and those mistakes would haunt the investigation for years. When officers first entered the Parker home, they treated it like an ordinary missing persons case rather than a potential crime scene. They did not rope off the living room where the girls had slept, nor did they collect every item that might have carried Melissa's prints. Parents, neighbors, and volunteers walked in and out, moving blankets, shifting bags, and even tidying up dishes from the night before. By the time detectives realized the seriousness of the case, whatever small clues might have been left were already gone. The back door, the one that had been found unlocked, was never dusted for prints that morning. A curtain swaying in the summer breeze was noted but not photographed. Even the half-empty glass of water that Melissa had carried earlier in the night was rinsed and put away by the Parkers, unaware it might have held the last clear evidence of her presence. The oversight would later be described as careless, but in those first hours the officers believed she would soon be found, perhaps walking back home or hiding with a friend. They expected her to reappear, embarrassed by the fuss, not to vanish without a trace. As the days passed and Melissa did not return, attention turned to the people who lived nearby. The neighborhood was the kind where most residents knew one another, where children rode their bikes freely and doors were often left unlocked. Yet there were always those who kept to themselves, and one name surfaced again and again in quiet conversations. Franklin Miller, a handyman in his late 30s, lived in a small rental a few streets away. He was known for taking on odd jobs, fixing fences, repairing gutters, painting sheds. He worked alone, spoke little, and rarely looked anyone in the eye. Several neighbors recalled seeing him walking late at night, carrying tools in an old canvas bag even when no one had hired him. A few mothers admitted that their children felt uneasy around him, describing the way he lingered near playgrounds or watched from across the street. One neighbor remembered him passing by the Parker house just days before the sleepover, glancing toward the backyard as if making note of it. Despite these accounts, no real follow-up was done. Detectives took his name, wrote it in their notes, and moved on. They were overwhelmed by tips, by rumors of strangers and sightings that led nowhere. Miller's reputation as odd but harmless worked in his favor. Without hard evidence linking him to Melissa, he was left alone. He continued his quiet routines, and the questions around him faded as weeks turned into months. Looking back, it is easy to see how important those early hours were. If the house had been secured, if every detail had been preserved, if the stories about Franklin Miller had been taken more seriously, perhaps the truth would have surfaced sooner. Instead, the trail went cold, and with it the chance to find Melissa before the years began to pile up. As the first months slipped into years, the energy around Melissa's case began to fade. The flyers that had once been bright and urgent turned yellow at the edges, curling under the weight of rain and wind. The nightly news no longer spoke her name. The reporters who had once crowded the Hartleys' front lawn moved on to other tragedies. At first, every phone call sparked hope. Every knock at the door sent the family rushing. But as time passed, those moments grew fewer until they nearly stopped altogether. The police still had a file with her picture clipped to the front, but the folder sat on a shelf gathering dust. Another unsolved mystery in a small town that wanted to move forward. For the Hartleys, there was no moving forward, only enduring. Melissa's room stayed exactly as it had been the night she left. Her posters of singers and movie stars were still taped to the walls, her books lined neatly on the shelf, her diary resting in the drawer where her mother had placed it for safekeeping. The bed was made each week, the quilt smoothed out, the stuffed animals arranged just as Melissa had liked them. Walking into the room felt like stepping back into 1987, a place untouched by time, a shrine to the daughter who had never returned. Her mother often sat on the edge of the bed, holding one of Melissa's sweaters, pressing it to her face, though the scent had long since faded. Her father kept the porch light on each night, a small signal of hope in case Melissa somehow found her way back. They lived inside an endless waiting, caught between hope and despair, never certain which one would swallow them first. Daniel, her younger brother, grew up under the shadow of her absence. At school he was known as the boy whose sister had vanished, a label he carried whether he wanted it or not. Teachers gave him sympathetic looks, classmates sometimes whispered behind his back, and birthdays were marked with a mix of celebration and grief. Each year, a cake was placed on the table, candles lit, but there was always an empty chair where Melissa should have been. Daniel learned to smile for his parents, to carry his pain quietly so as not to add to theirs. Tips still trickled in from time to time. A traveler claimed to have seen a girl who looked like Melissa in another state. A neighbor thought they recognized her in a crowd years later. Police followed up when they could, but each lead dissolved into nothing. Every disappointment cut deep, yet the Hartleys clung to the smallest possibility. They kept a box filled with clippings, letters, and notes from strangers who offered prayers. Hope was all they had, and even when it felt fragile, they refused to let it die. The seasons changed, the town rebuilt itself. New families moved into houses where old neighbors had once lived. Yet inside the Hartley home, the year 1987 never truly ended. Time carried everyone else forward, but for them, it remained frozen, waiting for the girl who had walked out of a living room one summer night and never walked back in. By the early 1990s, Melissa's case was no longer in the headlines, but it had never left the hearts of her family. They carried her absence like a scar, invisible to strangers but always present in their lives. Then, when two more teenagers vanished from towns less than 50 miles away, the wound opened again. At first, the disappearances seemed separate, tragedies that belonged to other families, but soon the details began to look eerily familiar. The first was in 1992, when 16-year-old Amanda Reeves disappeared after a sleepover at her best friend's house in a town west of where Melissa had lived. The girls had been celebrating the start of summer vacation, staying up late with music and soda. Sometime after midnight, Amanda excused herself to grab a sweater from the front porch. She never came back. Her bag, her shoes, and her purse were found inside. The door was left unlocked. No sign of struggle, no broken glass, no footprints. Police searched fields and rivers. Helicopters swept across the countryside, but Amanda was gone. Her parents stood in front of cameras and begged for answers, their words hauntingly similar to what the Hartleys had said 5 years earlier. Then in 1996, 14-year-old Brian Porter vanished from his cousin's house in another nearby town. It was a Friday night, the boys playing video games until they fell asleep on the living room floor. Around 2 in the morning, Brian rose to use the bathroom, but when his cousin woke hours later, he was gone. The front door was found slightly ajar, but there was no forced entry. His backpack remained by the couch, his wallet and bike untouched in the garage. Again, police brought in dogs. Again, the scent carried only as far as the end of the street before it faded into nothing. When news of these cases reached Melissa's parents, they felt the same sickening chill they had felt years before. The details matched too closely to be coincidence. Teenagers vanishing in the night, suburban homes with no signs of forced entry, belongings left behind as if the victims had simply stepped outside for a moment and been swallowed by the dark. Families of the missing began to speak with one another, forming fragile connections through grief. They compared notes, shared memories, and soon realized the parallels were undeniable. The police resisted at first, treating each case as its own mystery. Departments in small towns rarely spoke to each other, and jurisdictional boundaries made cooperation slow. But the families knew. They saw the pattern even if officials did not. Mothers and fathers sat together at vigils, lighting candles, clutching photographs, whispering that it could not just be chance. Someone was moving through their towns, watching, waiting, taking children in the quietest hours when no one was prepared. By the end of the decade, 3 families were bound by the same hollow absence. They did not yet know the name of the man who had taken their children, but they knew his presence lingered. In neighborhoods that once felt safe, locks were changed, lights were left on, and fear became a steady companion. In 2005, nearly 2 decades after Melissa disappeared, a retired officer named Henry Collins was cleaning out the attic of his home. He had served on the force for 30 years and had been part of the first search for Melissa back in 1987. Now, long after leaving the department, he kept boxes filled with old case files and personal notes stacked in dusty corners. His wife urged him to clear the clutter, and one rainy afternoon he finally gave in. He did not expect to find anything important, just fading papers and forgotten mementos. But as he opened one of the boxes marked with Melissa's name, he felt a familiar ache in his chest. Inside were documents from those early days, copies of reports, lists of volunteers, photographs of the search parties. Beneath them lay a small leather-bound book wrapped in plastic, tagged only with a piece of masking tape that read, "Evidence." Collins's heart sank when he realized what it was. He remembered the diary being mentioned, but somehow it had never been entered into the official chain of custody. It must have been overlooked, set aside during the chaos of those first days, and when he retired he had unknowingly carried it home with other case materials. For 18 years it had sat in his attic, untouched, a silent witness waiting to be heard. Collins slipped off the plastic and opened the diary. The handwriting was neat, the ink slightly faded, the words spilling across the pages with the unguarded honesty of a 14-year-old girl. She had written about her friends, about school, about how much she loved summer nights when the air was warm and the cicadas sang. She wrote about her little brother and how he annoyed her sometimes, though she also admitted she would miss him when he went to camp. The entries were ordinary, almost comforting, until he turned to the last page. The handwriting there was hurried, the letters uneven as if written in fear. The words made Collins's stomach twist. "The man from next door keeps watching us. He knows when Mom and Dad aren't home." There was no signature, no date beyond the month written at the top of the page. June 1987. Collins closed the diary and sat in silence, the rain tapping against the roof above him. Memories flooded back of that summer, of neighbors whispering about a handyman named Franklin Miller, of uneasy glances that were never pursued. He realized now that Melissa had noticed him too. She had felt something was wrong, had written it down, and the clue had been lost in a cardboard box. The discovery left Collins shaken. He knew he had to bring it forward, though he also knew it meant admitting a mistake, one that had stolen years from a grieving family. When he delivered the diary to the department, younger detectives listened with wide eyes as he explained. For the Hartleys, the words were both devastating and validating. Their daughter had tried to warn them, her final entry carrying the fear she had felt, and for 18 years it had been left unread. In the summer of 2009, the old Miller property had become an eyesore at the edge of town. The house had been empty for years, its paint peeling in long strips, windows cracked, the yard swallowed by weeds. Most people avoided walking near it. Children dared each other to run up the porch steps and touch the front door before sprinting away in laughter. For neighbors who remembered Franklin Miller, the handyman who once lived there, the place carried a darker weight. He had disappeared suddenly in the early 90s, and since then the house had stood silent, its walls holding secrets no one could name. That summer a developer bought the property, planning to clear the lot and build new homes. To the workers who arrived with tool belts and crowbars, it was just another decaying structure to gut. They moved through the rooms quickly, knocking down cabinets, tearing up stained carpet, hauling out junk left behind. Dust rose in thick clouds, coating their skin and clothing. In the basement they expected the same, only more clutter, but what they found there was strange enough to stop them in their tracks. Along one wall stood a set of wooden shelves. At first glance they seemed ordinary, stacked with old paint cans, rusted nails, and tools too corroded to use. But when 2 men tried to shift the shelves, they noticed the weight was unusual, as if something solid lay hidden behind. They pulled the shelves forward, scraping them across the cement floor. To their surprise, the wall was not a wall at all. The outline of a door appeared, Heavy iron set into the concrete, its surface mottled with rust. The workers exchanged nervous laughs, trying to brush off the unease that swept through them. One joked about buried treasure. Another said it looked more like something out of a prison. They ran their hands across the cold metal, finding no handle, only a thick padlock that had fused with rust over the years. The door was solid, unnatural in a family basement. They called their supervisor, who came down with a flashlight, his face tight with concern. He ordered the men to cut through the lock. The saw screamed against the corroded metal, sparks flying in bursts of orange. The smell of burnt iron filled the air. When the lock finally snapped, the men hesitated. A sour odor leaked through the cracks, the stale breath of a room sealed for decades. Slowly, with a long groan, the door creaked open. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The beam of a flashlight swept over the steps, revealing dust and cobwebs that had built up over years. No one wanted to be the first to go down, but curiosity pushed them forward. As they stepped into the hidden chamber, their lights caught on a small cot, a table, and walls that seemed to press inward. The silence was heavy, the air thick. Something about the room felt wrong, as if it had been waiting all this time to be uncovered. The discovery was only the beginning, but even then the workers knew the house had not been empty after all. When police arrived at the Miller property, they wasted no time sealing the area. The workers who had uncovered the iron door stood outside in the humid air, shaken and pale, their voices low as they explained what they had seen. Officers descended into the basement with flashlights and tools, their boots echoing against the concrete. The iron door stood open now, the broken padlock lying in pieces on the floor. The narrow staircase leading down seemed to swallow the light, each step coated in dust that had not been disturbed in years. The officers moved carefully, their beams cutting through the gloom as they reached the bottom of the stairs. What opened before them was not a simple storage room but a hidden chamber, carved into the foundation with unsettling precision. The air was thick and stale, pressing against their lungs, carrying the sharp odor of rot and rust. Against one wall sat two old mattresses, thin and stained, their fabric torn. Metal loops had been bolted into the floor near the bed frames, the kind of detail that turned unease into dread. On a small wooden table were objects that seemed ordinary at first glance but felt sinister in that place. A comb with strands of hair still caught between its teeth. A shoe scuffed at the heel, a faded notebook with several pages missing. In the far corner of the chamber, a cardboard box sagged under the weight of time. An officer crouched and lifted the lid, revealing a collection of personal belongings that did not seem to belong to the same person. A child's backpack with worn straps, a tangle of jewelry, a cassette tape labeled with a name no one recognized. Among these items was something that made the room fall silent. Wrapped in a thin cloth lay a bracelet, the silver dulled with age but still engraved with the letters M.H. One of the detectives whispered the name, Melissa Hartley, and the weight of the discovery settled on them all. The missing girl from 1987, whose case had haunted the town for more than 20 years, was suddenly tied to this place. The chamber was photographed from every angle, evidence bags filling quickly as officers collected each item. Restraints were catalogued, the mattresses carefully removed, the bracelet sealed in a clear pouch. The work was methodical, but beneath the routine was an unspoken horror. This was not just a hidden room, it was a prison. Someone had built it to hold people, to keep them out of sight, to erase them from the world above. Outside, news spread fast. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, whispering, remembering Franklin Miller and the unease he had left behind. The Hartleys were notified within hours, their lives once again pulled into the storm they had lived through decades earlier. For the first time there was proof, cold and undeniable, that Melissa had not run away, had not simply vanished into the night. She had been here, in this chamber, her bracelet left behind as a silent cry for someone to find her. Detectives thought they had seen the worst of the basement when they uncovered the mattresses and restraints, but deeper in the chamber stood an object that made their breath catch. Against the far wall was a rusted storage locker, its surface flaking with age, the hinges swollen with corrosion. At first glance it looked like nothing more than an old piece of furniture left behind, but the lock securing it was heavy and deliberate, as though whatever lay inside had been meant to stay hidden. Officers pried at the latch until it snapped, the sound echoing through the concrete room. When the door creaked open, the beam of a flashlight revealed a stack of objects arranged with unsettling care. At the top sat a small, portable cassette player, a Walkman popular in the 80s, its earphones tangled around the handle. It looked out of place in the year 2009, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of history. Inside was a tape, labeled with a name that detectives quickly matched to another missing teenager from the early 90s. The realization chilled everyone present. Beneath the Walkman lay a bundle of Polaroid photographs, the edges curled, the images faded but still sharp enough to recognize faces. Some showed teenagers smiling awkwardly. Others captured them in more candid moments, sitting on porches or walking down streets. The dates scrawled on the bottom matched the years of several unsolved disappearances. Detectives stared at the faces, some of which they remembered from old case files and news broadcasts. It was like opening a window into the past, one that revealed not only Melissa's fate but the suffering of others who had simply disappeared without explanation. Further inside, the locker was clothing neatly folded, preserved, despite the damp air. Each piece carried a tag, a strip of tape, or a piece of paper pinned to the fabric, with a name written in block letters. Amanda Reeves, 1992. Brian Porter, 1996. Names that matched missing person reports from neighboring towns. The evidence was overwhelming, each item a link in a chain of tragedies that stretched across decades. The basement was no longer just connected to Melissa. It was tied to a larger pattern of vanishing teens whose families had been left with questions and no answers. Officers worked carefully, photographing every item, placing them into evidence bags with gloved hands. The room grew quieter as the weight of the discovery settled over them. This was not the work of chance. It was the work of someone methodical, someone who collected tokens from each life they had stolen. The Walkmen, the photographs, the clothing with names, all spoke of a ritual of remembrance twisted into cruelty. Word spread quickly once the items were logged. Families who had carried grief for years were called, each conversation reopening wounds that had never healed. The Hartleys, the Reeves, the Porters, all learned their children's belongings had been found in the basement of Franklin Miller's abandoned house. For the first time, there was no doubt that their loved ones had all been part of the same dark story. For weeks after the discovery, the chamber beneath the Miller property became the center of an enormous investigation. Every inch of the room was examined, every scrap of fabric, every hair strand, every fingerprint lifted from the rusted surfaces. Forensic teams worked day and night, their gloved hands steady as they packed evidence into bags and carried it out under the eyes of waiting reporters. Families gathered outside the police station desperate for news, their hopes and fears hanging on the promise of science. The breakthrough came slowly, each test result adding to a grim picture. The bracelet with the initials MH was compared against DNA samples from Melissa's mother and father. The results confirmed what everyone had already feared. The traces of blood on the clasp matched Melissa. After more than 20 years, her presence in that chamber was no longer just suspected, it was proven. Her parents wept when they heard the news. The confirmation both a wound and a kind of closure. But Melissa was not the only one tied to that room. Fibers collected from the mattresses carried traces of DNA that matched Amanda Reeves, the 16-year-old who had disappeared in 1992. Another fragment of fabric, caught in a corner of the rusted locker, held DNA belonging to Brian Porter, the boy who vanished in 1996. Each result was devastating, connecting case after case to the same hidden basement. What had once been scattered, mysteries spread across towns and years, were now part of a single dark story. Detectives who had worked the older cases returned to the department, shaken by the revelations. They remembered the families, the unanswered questions, the endless searches that had led nowhere. Now the answers were arriving all at once, too late to save anyone, but enough to confirm what many had suspected. Someone had built that chamber to be used again and again, a prison carefully hidden beneath an ordinary house, a place where lives were ended while the world above carried on unaware. The media seized on the discovery, headlines describing the basement as a dungeon, a tomb, a secret lair of evil. Television crews parked outside the property, their lights casting eerie shadows across the broken windows. Forensic trucks came and went, their doors slamming shut on boxes of evidence that told stories no one wanted to imagine. Reporters interviewed neighbors who admitted they had always felt uneasy about Franklin Miller, though none had spoken loudly enough when it might have mattered. Behind closed doors, investigators pieced together the timeline. The chamber showed signs of being altered over the years. Repairs made, locks reinforced, the hidden door camouflaged by shelves. It was not a forgotten project, but a place deliberately maintained. Every discovery deepened the sense of horror. The chamber was not just where Melissa had been taken, it was where others had followed, each one drawn into the same trap while families waited at home for calls that never came. By the time the tests were complete, investigators knew the truth with certainty. The chamber was no accident. It was a prison, used over decades, tied to the vanishings of children who had haunted the region for more than 20 years. With the evidence from the basement pointing toward a deliberate and calculated hand, investigators turned their focus back to the one man who had lived in the house when Melissa disappeared. Franklin Miller's name returned to conversations in police stations, newsrooms, and neighborhood kitchens, carrying with it a weight of unease that had lingered for decades. People who had once whispered about him were suddenly eager to share their memories, and what they recalled painted the picture of a man who had always seemed just a little out of step with the world around him. Neighbors remembered the odd hours he kept. His lights burned late into the night, long after others on the street had gone to bed. Some said they would hear the sound of hammering or drilling coming from the basement, as if he worked on projects no one ever saw. Others mentioned seeing him walking the streets in the early hours of the morning, carrying his heavy canvas tool bag, though no one had hired him. He rarely stopped to talk, and when he did, his answers were clipped, his eyes darting as though he wanted the conversation to end. There was also his obsession with locks. Miller was known to padlock everything, from his shed to his truck, even the gate at the side of his house. Children in the neighborhood joked that he had more keys than a janitor, a heavy ring that jingled whenever he moved. He claimed he worried about theft, though nothing of value seemed to be stored in those places. The memory of his constant locking and relocking of doors now felt sinister, a clue no one had taken seriously at the time. When investigators dug into records, they found his disappearance in 1991 had been sudden and unexplained. One day he was in town repairing gutters, mowing lawns, patching fences, and the next, he was gone. His mail piled up, his phone was disconnected, and the house fell silent. There were no forwarding addresses, no work orders in other towns, no sign of where he might have gone. At the time, police assumed he had simply left to start over somewhere else, another drifter who came and went without notice. But with the chamber uncovered beneath his home, that departure looked less like a move and more like an escape. Reporters swarmed the story, interviewing anyone who had known him. Some remembered him as polite but distant. Others said he made their skin crawl. One former employer recalled how Miller had asked odd questions about building materials, especially about ways to reinforce walls and hide doors. Another neighbor confessed she had always kept her children away from him, unsettled by the way he lingered near playground fences without reason. For investigators, the pieces began to align. A man with no close friends, a fixation on locks and secrecy, late-night noises in the basement, and a disappearance that matched the timeline of growing suspicion. Franklin Miller had always been part of the story, but now he became its central figure, the man who had built a prison beneath his home and then vanished when the eyes of the town grew too sharp. The search for Franklin Miller became one of the most determined efforts the FBI had launched in the region in years. Once the chamber was uncovered and the evidence tied back to Melissa and the other missing teens, Miller was no longer just a person of interest, he was the only name that fit. Agents began piecing together his movements after 1991, chasing a paper trail that was thin but not invisible. What they found suggested that Miller had spent almost 2 decades hiding in plain sight, always moving, always one step ahead of suspicion. Records showed that after he abandoned the house in 1991, he began using false identities. The first appeared in a small-town bank in Iowa, where a man calling himself George Walker opened an account with cash deposits and no clear source of income. The handwriting on the forms matched Miller's, though the name did not. Months later, another alias surfaced, this time in Missouri, when someone named Carl Benson applied for a post office box. The descriptions given by clerks were vague but consistent. A thin man with tired eyes, quiet, polite, gone before anyone noticed much else. Agents discovered that Miller avoided formal jobs that required background checks. Instead, he took cash work, fixing fences, chopping firewood, repairing cabins for landlords who asked few questions. He stayed off the grid, never applying for credit cards, never buying property in his own name. When he rented cabins, he used aliases and paid in cash, often staying just long enough to make improvements before disappearing again. Several landlords remembered him because he was meticulous, sealing windows, reinforcing doors, and sometimes building shelves or storage units in basements. What seemed like quirks of a careful tenant now looked like the habits of a man preparing safe places wherever he went. The Midwest became his hunting ground. Cabins in Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Illinois all showed signs of his passing. In some, agents found padlocks identical to those recovered from the basement in his old house. In others, they found empty food cans stacked neatly, suggesting he had lived there for weeks at a time. One cabin in Indiana contained scraps of newspaper articles about missing teenagers, cut carefully and tucked inside a folder. Though no direct evidence tied him to new crimes, the implication was clear. Miller had not stopped after leaving town. He had only widened his reach. The manhunt intensified. Posters with his face, aged through computer imaging, were sent across the country. Truck stops, post offices, and diners received bulletins warning workers to look for a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a fondness for heavy key rings. Tips began to pour in. some false, some possible. A gas station clerk in Kansas swore he had seen him filling cans with fuel. A farmer in Minnesota reported a stranger asking about cabins to rent near the woods. Each lead was pursued, each road followed, but Miller remained a ghost, moving quietly across state lines, always careful to erase his tracks. For the families of the missing, the manhunt was both hope and torment. Hope that Miller might finally be caught, torment in knowing that he had lived free for so many years while their children never came home. The FBI pressed on, convinced that somewhere out there Miller was still alive, still carrying his secrets, and maybe still watching for his next chance. In the spring of 2010, a call came into the FBI tip line from a woman in northern Florida who worked at a small RV park off a forgotten highway. She explained that one of her long-term renters had always unsettled her, a man in his 60s who kept to himself and rarely spoke. He paid in cash every month, never used a phone, and lived in an aging trailer tucked at the far edge of the park where the palmettos grew thick around the lot. He introduced himself as Harold Green, but something about him never seemed right. When she saw a news piece about Franklin Miller and the reconstructed images showing what he might look like after 2 decades, she felt a jolt of recognition. Agents arrived within days, careful not to alarm the man or the small community around him. They parked unmarked vehicles near the park and watched. Through binoculars, they saw a thin figure with graying hair step out of the trailer each morning, always at dawn, to sweep the small porch and padlock the door before leaving. He moved with a stiffness that suggested age, yet there was a deliberate quality in the way he checked his surroundings, scanning the area before walking to a shed where he kept his tools. He rarely spoke to neighbors, and when he did, his words were short, his eyes always darting back toward his trailer. The agents confirmed that the man used cash for everything, from groceries to gas. He left no paper trail, no credit cards, no bank accounts. At night, a dim light burned inside the trailer until late, the shadow of his figure moving slowly past the curtains. The parallels to Miller's old habits were too strong to ignore: the padlocks, the odd hours, the isolation. After a week of surveillance, they moved in. Just before sunrise, when the sky was still painted gray and the park was silent, a team approached. The morning air was damp, the grass wet with dew, the sound of insects loud in the stillness. They surrounded the trailer, weapons lowered but ready. An agent knocked softly on the thin metal door. A pause followed, then the creak of footsteps inside. When the door opened, the man stood there barefoot, his hair unkempt, his face lined with age. He raised his hands slowly, almost as if he had been expecting them. The arrest was quiet. There was no struggle, no raised voice, only the shuffle of feet on gravel as agents guided him out into the dawn. Neighbors woke to the sight of flashing lights reflecting against the palm trees, watching in stunned silence as the man they knew as Harold Green was placed in a vehicle and driven away. At the station, fingerprints confirmed what the agents already knew. Harold Green was Franklin Miller. After nearly 2 decades of silence, the man suspected of building a basement prison and linked to multiple disappearances had finally been found. The families who had waited so long received the news with a mixture of grief and relief. The hunt was over, but the hardest questions were still to come. The interrogation room was stark and silent when Franklin Miller was led inside. He sat across from the agents, his wrists cuffed, his shoulders slouched, his eyes fixed on the table as though the weight of the years had finally pressed him down. For hours he said nothing, answering questions with shrugs or mumbled words. But as the night stretched on, he began to speak. His voice was flat, almost casual, as if he were discussing something ordinary instead of the darkest secrets of his life. He admitted that he had taken Melissa Hartley from the Parker home in 1987. He claimed he had watched the house for days, learning when parents were distracted, when the girls were alone. On the night of the sleepover, he slipped through the back door, silent and patient, and waited until Melissa walked toward the kitchen. He said he covered her mouth, led her outside, and within minutes she was in his truck, unseen by anyone else. To him, it had been simple, a matter of timing and control. Miller told investigators that Melissa had died within days of being brought to his basement, but the agents listening did not believe him. The items found in the chamber told another story. Her bracelet was left near the cot, her hair was tangled in the comb, her handwriting was discovered in faint scrawls on scraps of paper tucked inside a notebook. Forensic analysis suggested she had been alive there for weeks, maybe even months, and the condition of the mattresses and restraints hinted at long-term captivity rather than a brief stay. When pressed, Miller offered chilling details about how he maintained control. He described how he reinforced the iron door, how he checked the locks again and again to reassure himself no one could escape. He spoke of rationing food, of keeping lights dim so time blurred together, of playing a radio softly to drown out any sound from above. He claimed he gave his captives water and blankets, insisting he was not cruel, but his words rang hollow against the reality of the chamber where every object whispered of suffering. Agents noted the way he avoided direct descriptions of Melissa herself. He spoke of her only as the girl, as if distancing himself from the humanity of his victim. He admitted to keeping her diary but refused to say why. When asked about the other belongings, the Walkman, the clothing, the Polaroids, he smirked faintly and said they were reminders, tokens of people who had trusted the world too much. Throughout the confession, Miller revealed a mind obsessed with secrecy. He explained how he used false names, how he built hiding places wherever he lived, how he moved before suspicion could catch up. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, invisible, always one step ahead. Yet, sitting in that room, surrounded by agents who finally had him cornered, his arrogance faltered. For the first time, the mask slipped, and the truth about what happened to Melissa and the others came into the light. The news reached the Hartleys on a gray morning in late autumn. After weeks of forensic testing, investigators confirmed that remains found in the chamber belonged to Melissa. The words were heavy, final, and though her parents had long suspected the truth, hearing it spoken aloud brought fresh waves of grief. For 22 years they had lived in the limbo of not knowing, clinging to hope even as the seasons passed without her. Now there was no more waiting. Melissa was gone, and her parents would finally bring her home. The day they collected her remains was quiet. The coroner placed the small box into their arms with care, as though understanding that the weight of it was far greater than its size. Her mother wept softly, clutching the box to her chest, whispering her daughter's name as if speaking it could bridge the distance of the years. Her father stood beside her, his face lined and weary, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. They had lived with questions for so long, and though answers had come, they were cruel answers, answers that closed doors forever. Other families received similar calls. Amanda Reeves, Brian Porter, and 2 others long believed lost to accidents or runaways were also identified through DNA. Their belongings had already been returned, and now their names were officially connected to Miller's crimes. Parents who had spent years organizing searches, raising money for private investigators, and begging for leads were finally told what had happened. The relief was hollow. They had wanted the truth, but the truth was a blade that cut deep. In the weeks that followed, the community gathered to honor all of the victims. A memorial service was held in the town square, where candles flickered against the cold evening air. Photographs of Melissa, Amanda, Brian, and the others were displayed along a long table, each face smiling from a moment in time before everything was taken. Families stood together, their grief shared, their stories intertwined by tragedy. Some spoke of the laughter and dreams of the children they had lost. Others simply held one another in silence. The service was not just for closure but for remembrance, a way to declare that these lives would not be reduced to case numbers in old files. The Hartleys sat near the front, Melissa's younger brother, now grown, standing tall beside them. He placed a sunflower on the table, his sister's favorite, and bowed his head. The service closed with the reading of each victim's name, the sound echoing through the square, a roll call of lives cut short but not forgotten. When Melissa's name was spoken, her mother squeezed her husband's hand, and for the first time in years, they felt the community surround them with warmth. Answers had come, but peace was still far away. The loss was too deep, the years too many. Yet, in that gathering, as candles burned against the dark, the families found strength in knowing they were not alone, that their children's names would live on, spoken and remembered. The trial of Franklin Miller ended with a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life, but the echoes of his crimes continued long after the courtroom was silent. Across the country, police departments and lawmakers began asking how a man like him could have operated for decades without being caught. Reports were written, committees formed, and for the first time in years, the system that had failed Melissa and the others was forced to change. New protocols were introduced, requiring quicker responses when children went missing, stronger communication between neighboring jurisdictions, and better training for handling evidence so nothing would be overlooked again. Melissa's diary, forgotten in a box for nearly 20 years, became a haunting example used in training sessions, a warning of how fragile justice could be when small mistakes were made. For the Hartleys, reform alone was not enough. Their lives had been torn apart, their daughter stolen and hidden away, and they refused to let her memory fade into tragedy alone. Together with other families, they started a foundation in Melissa's name, focused on supporting at-risk youth and educating communities about the dangers that could lurk even in safe-looking streets. They raised funds for scholarships, sponsored after-school programs, and spoke at schools about trust, vigilance, and the importance of protecting one another. Her mother often said that Melissa had loved helping others, that she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, and through the foundation she was still reaching out, still shaping young lives. The house where Miller had built his chamber was eventually torn down. The basement, once sealed and hidden, was demolished until nothing remained but open soil. A new home could have been built there, but the community chose instead to leave the land empty, turning it into a small green lot with benches and flowers. It became a place of quiet reflection, where neighbors could sit and remember the victims. Though the iron door was gone and the walls reduced to rubble, the memory of what had been discovered beneath that house lingered. It served as a reminder that evil could hide behind the most ordinary facades, that a neat lawn and a polite nod from a neighbor could conceal horrors unimaginable. The story of Melissa and the others endured, told in documentaries, written into books, discussed in classrooms. It was not kept alive for the sake of fear, but as a way to honor those who had been lost and to warn against complacency. Parents taught their children to be cautious, communities learned to watch more closely, and investigators carried the lesson that no case was too small, no clue unimportant. Years later, when people walked past the small garden where the Miller house had once stood, they saw flowers blooming where darkness had thrived. They saw families sitting together, children playing, and they remembered that the story was not only about loss, but about resilience. Evil had left its mark, but love and determination had ensured it would not be the final word.